Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute epic that is the story of the House of Bourbon. It's a family that literally shaped the blueprint of absolute power in Europe. If you've ever wondered how modern state centralization, insanely opulent royal courts, and world-shaking revolutions all tie back to a single bloodline, well, you are definitely in the right place. Let's trace their path and uncover exactly how a relatively minor family came to rule essentially the world. So how did a minor noble family become the absolute rulers of Europe? Let's dive right into this because their unprecedented ascent from minor nobility to global dominance perfectly illustrates how absolute power can both build and completely destroy an empire. It's a fascinating paradox, really. The Bourbons weren't always the glittering absolute monarchs we picture when we hear the name. Actually, they started out on the absolute periphery of true power. So how did they maneuver themselves into controlling not just France, but vast stretches of Europe and the Americas? Part 1. The Modest Roots, the Cadet Branch. To really understand their peak, we have to look at their beginnings. The Bourbons started their journey not with kings, but with pretty modest origins as a cadet branch. That's essentially a junior line of the ruling Capetian dynasty. Believe it or not, it took over 300 years of serving under other kings before a massive crisis finally cleared their path. Back in 1272, Robert, the youngest son of King Louis IX, married Beatrice of Bourbon. This union merged royal blood with the Bourbon estate. Fast forward a bit to 1327, and their descendant Louis is made the first Duke of Bourbon. For centuries, they are loyal nobles, fighting, serving, you know the drill. But notice what happens in 1527. The senior line of the family actually dies out after Duke Charles III falls, and the junior line, the Bourbon Vendômes, steps up to become the senior branch. It isn't until 1589, when the ruling House of Versailles completely dies out in the male line, that French Salic law, which is a rule stating only men could inherit the throne, dictates the crown has to pass to the closest male relative. And guess what? That happened to be a Bourbon. Moving on to Part 2, the Bloody Rise, Henry IV and the Wars of Religion. You see, the Bourbons didn't inherit a peaceful kingdom. They inherited an absolute war zone. Their rise was forged in the fire of the French Wars of Religion. This immense tension culminated in the War of the Three Henrys. On one side, you had Henry of Navarre, the head of the Bourbon family. He was a Protestant fighting to claim a heavily Catholic France. Standing right in his way was the deeply entrenched Catholic establishment, who vehemently opposed a Protestant king. This was a deeply ideological and incredibly bloody civil war that literally tore the nation apart. But Henry IV was a pragmatic survivor. He realized pretty quickly he couldn't rule a fractured nation, so he converted to Catholicism in 1593 just to secure the crown and appease the majority. But to stop the bleeding, he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598. This was a groundbreaking blueprint for religious tolerance that was incredibly rare and, honestly, incredibly risky for its time. Through this, he managed to unite the thrones of France and Navarre, repair the kingdom's crumbling infrastructure, and lay the absolute vital groundwork for the dynasty's future power. Part 3. The Zenith of Absolutism, the Sun King. So, with the religious wars firmly behind them and their foundation secure, the Bourbons transitioned from mere survival into an era of unmatched opulent control under his grandson, Louis XIV. The sheer scale of his authority was just staggering. Louis XIV became the longest reigning sovereign of his time, completely centralizing the French state around himself. Reigning from 1643 all the way to 1715, he famously declared himself the center of the nation. Literally, much like the sun is the center of the solar system. That's exactly where the Sun King name comes from. He systematically stripped the nobility of their independent power, drawing them right into his dazzling court where he could keep a very close, watchful eye on them. But while he built this incredibly powerful nation, the cracks of absolute control definitely began to show. On one hand, he centralized power and expanded colonies in the Americas, transforming France into the premier military and cultural power of Europe. But on the other hand, he also revoked his grandfather's Edict of Nantes. This forced countless Protestant Huguenots into exile, essentially causing a massive brain drain of France's skilled workforce. Furthermore, his relentless wars of expansion required massive funding, leaving the national treasury severely depleted. He was creating a masterpiece of a state, sure, but he was funding it with a credit card that future Bourbons were eventually going to have to pay off. Which brings us to part 4, Bourbons beyond French borders. At their absolute peak, Bourbon ambition just couldn't be contained within France. When Louis XIV's grandson, Philip V, inherited the Spanish throne in 1700, a terrified Europe totally panicked, kicking off the War of the Spanish Succession. What happened was the Habsburg King of Spain, Charles II, had died without a child, leaving his massive empire to the Bourbon prince. The Grand Alliance formed almost immediately. Countries like England and the Habsburg Empire realized that if the vast resources of France and Spain were united under one single Bourbon ruler, the balance of power in Europe would be permanently shattered. No way were they going to let that happen.
So the resulting 1713 Treaty of Utrecht cemented the Bourbons as a global dynasty, placing them on the Spanish throne where their descendants, like King Philippe VI, actually remain today. But there was a major compromise needed to prevent a superpower monopoly. Philip V got to keep Spain and its overseas colonies, but he had to formally renounce any claim whatsoever to the French throne, ensuring the two crowns could never, ever unite. Furthermore, Spain had to give up major European territories like Milan, Naples, and Sicily. This actually laid the groundwork for future cadet branches like the Bourbons of the two Sicilies and Parma, further weaving Bourbon DNA right into the map of Europe.
And now, part 5, the breaking point, hubris, and revolution. Like the saying goes, the higher the rise, the harder the fall. By the late 18th century, King Louis XVI inherited a completely bankrupt nation. And it wasn't just one thing. It was a 59-year reign by his predecessor, Louis XV, that saw the loss of New France in the 7 Years' War, followed by Louis XVI pouring France's remaining treasure into the American War of Independence. Combine that crippling debt with a rising middle class absorbing new Enlightenment concepts of equality and liberty, and a nobility that flat out refused to pay taxes or accept any reforms at all, the pressure cooker was sealed tight and the heat was turned all the way up. It's wild to think about, but the dynasty went from total, unquestioned, absolute power to the guillotine in just a few short years. Here's how fast it went down. In 1789, the revolution begins. By 1791, the king's divine right is stripped away in favor of a constitutional monarchy. A year later, in 1792, the centuries-old monarchy is abolished entirely, replaced by the First French Republic. And finally, in 1793, the descendant of the Sun King, Louis XVI, alongside his wife, Marie Antoinette, is executed for high treason. While the Bourbons would see brief periods of restoration in the 19th century under kings like Louis XVIII and Charles X, and even a cadet branch under the citizen king, Louis Philippe, the absolute power they had spent centuries engineering was gone forever by 1848. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider a big question. Does unprecedented absolute power always sow the seeds of its own destruction? Were the very mechanisms the Bourbons used to achieve total control precisely what guaranteed their tragic downfall? By centralizing everything, ignoring massive debts, and alienating their own people, it's like they built a beautiful, gilded trap for themselves. The House of Bourbon absolutely defined an era of human history, but looking at their spectacular collapse, we have to ask ourselves, when modern leaders and institutions consolidate absolute power today, are they just building their own guillotine? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and remember to keep questioning the structures of power all around you.